Hi, this is Kevin Trainer, and I'd like to welcome you to my lecture on Chapter 3 of the Schwalbe text. And Chapter 3 is entitled The Project Management Process Groups, a Case Study. So you'll recall that the PMI framework for organizing the knowledge about project management is a faceted classification scheme, as we would say in the LIS world. One of the taxonomies that we use is the knowledge groups, and there are 10 of them. And we've gone through them in a previous chapter. Another one of the classification schemes or taxonomies is the project management process groups, and there are 5 of these. So we're going to try to do a couple things within the chapter. One is we want to acquaint you with the process groups, and that's going to be important to do because the book is not organized according to the process groups. We'll be talking about them as time goes by. But the organization of the book is on the other facet. It's on the knowledge areas. So here's our opportunity to give some airtime to the process groups. All right. The other thing here is we want to talk through an actual project. And as such, we picked a modest-sized project for a consulting company, kind of a web-related project that we're going to be doing. And we're looking at it to kind of think back to the last of the chapters in Chapter 2. We said that project management methodology-wise, that there were kind of 2 families of approaches that people take. There was the predictive family of approaches, which is probably most notably characterized by what we call the Waterfall method. And then there are the adaptive family of approaches to ways to manage projects. And that's most notably characterized by Scrum. So what we're going to do is we're not only going to talk you through one approach to managing our case, we're going to talk you through 2. So we're going to talk you through sort of a waterfall approach and a Scrum approach, okay? And I can't emphasize enough that I don't think that your job at this point is to decide which you like better, okay? It's not to decide whether one's right and the other's wrong, okay? It's to really appreciate what they all have to offer, because I think that in the long run, somebody is going to articulate a framework that really brings everything in and puts it in its own place. And the apparent contradictions of today, where we have 2 competing groups with what they might say are kind of antithetical approaches to managing projects, I think we're going to come to see them on some interrelated continuum. So I don't think it really serves you well to decide who's right and who's wrong. It'd probably do better to just be looking for things that you like about one or the other. And I think you're going to find that most helpful. This is the first chapter that we're going to have in the text. It's going to have this kind of organization. We're going to at the very beginning of the chapter, we're going to try to tie the things we're talking about to the PMI project management body of knowledge. Okay. And so those are typically the things we're going to talk about first in the process. So the project management process groups are, again, the second of the two, really the first of the two classification schemes that we use. Typically, we talk about the process groups before we talk about the knowledge areas. A process is a series of actions directed toward a particular result. Project management can be viewed as a number of interlinked processes. The project management process groups, as identified by PMI, include initiating processes, planning processes, executing processes, monitoring and controlling processes, and closing processes. So, you might think that because we've got 5 process groups, that we spend an equal amount of time in each one. And no, we don't. Okay. Now, let's see if we have. No, we don't have the graphic that I'm thinking of in this version of the slide. So I'll talk about it. Okay. So of initiating, planning, executing, and closing, typically you can think of those as almost kind of phase oriented. Okay. So these are process groups. The initiating ones happen first, then the planning ones, then the executing ones, then the closing ones. Okay. Now, there's a little bit of an exception to that, but for the most part, that's true. And then monitoring and controlling is not really separated chronologically. So there's a diagram somewhere that shows the initiating, planning, executing, and closing as kind of consecutive bars on a bar chart. And then there's a layer on top of them that is monitoring and controlling. And you can think that this is something that's going on a little bit all the time. So chronologically, that's how they play out. So we're looking at the percentage of their time that is expended by the project team on particular projects, and we're comparing how the alpha dogs do compared to the normal dogs. Okay, so the alpha PMs are the big successful ones, and the other ones are, the run-of-the-mill ones. So you can see that the proportion of time that they spend in each of the process groups is comparable. Okay, the bulk of the time is going into executing. Okay, a little time into initiating and closing, a little more into monitoring and controlling, a little more than that into planning. But there's an interesting difference between the two groups, and that's this. The alpha project managers, who are going to say the people who really seem to be good at this, spend more time on planning and less time on executing. So they're spending on planning 21% of their time, and on executing they're spending 69% of their time. So if you add those two up, they're spending 90% of their time. And then the rest, the also-rans, are spending 11% of their time on planning, about half as much as the alphas, and 82% of their time on executing. So that's 13% more than the alphas. And here's how I read this, okay? there is a tendency to be pushed out of planning activities quickly because planning activities don't look productive. Okay, people are talking, people are using planning tools, people are analyzing. Are they writing code? No, they're not writing code. Are they testing code? No, they're not testing code. So for people who are very literal about what productivity is, the only productivity is turning out the end products of the project, then they get kind of itchy during the planning phase. Senior management tends to get itchy during the planning phase, and they tend to say things like, I don't know why you're doing all this planning. I want to see you get started. So give us some numbers that we can agree to and get going. And so what happens is that less experienced, less authoritative PMs tend to get pushed from planning into execution probably before they're fully ready. And that's the reason why it takes them so long to execute, because they don't have well-planned projects. So the takeaway from this is to try to increase your confidence over time, to spend a bit more time in planning with the expectation that you'll more than make up for it in reduction of the execution time. Okay, so that's what we're trying to preach on slide 3. Now, a pretty interesting exercise is to take the two classification schemes that we're using for the project management body of knowledge and to see how they interrelate. So typically, if you have any two classification schemes and you want to see how they interrelate, well, you create a table where you have one classification scheme in the rows and another classification scheme in the columns. And then you create some kind of annotations to say what happens in each intersection of rows and columns. And this has been done for the project management body of knowledge. And the next couple of pages give us some insight into how these things interrelate. Okay, so here on slide 5, we have a table from the textbook, and we can see we've got the first 3 of the knowledge areas: project integration, management, and then we have scope and time. And then we have all 5 of the process groups: initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, and controlling, and closing. And what you can do is you can look at what things are in the intersection of the two. So project integration management has a lot of the important activities. It's the pull together secret sauce kind of knowledge group. So the thing that we do in initiating that is related to the integration knowledge area is developing the project charter, a key document. In planning, developing the project plan, another key document. In executing, direct and manage the project work. Well, that's very important. In monitoring and controlling, generally monitoring and controlling the work, performing change control. And in closing, closing the project or phase that you're in. So those make a lot of sense. Let's look at there's another page to this. So let's look at the second page. So Let's look at project human resource management, which is the third bar on the chart. And you can see that in planning, we're going to plan human resource management, and in executing, we're going to acquire the project team, develop the project team, manage the project team. So you can see how these things interrelate with each other. Okay? Now, this is just to help you get a feel for this overall multifaceted classification scheme. There is, if you decide that you want to get a certification as a PMP, there are a number of questions on the PMI certification exam for PMP that ask to have, say, true falses, or no, they're all multiple choices, but they'll say that such and such a process is part of which of the process groups or which of the knowledge areas. And so being able to visualize this table is pretty helpful for being able to answer those kinds of questions. Now, apart from test taking, I think having a good feel for this is useful. And I encourage you to read the table and get comfortable with it. Okay, so not all the projects that students in this class are going to be doing are going to be IT projects. Some students are going to be doing things related to library and information science that are, classic things that we do that are not IT related. Perhaps we're building a new physical library. Perhaps we're moving from one library to another library. Perhaps we're opening a branch library. Perhaps let's say we're in a museum and we're building a new exhibit and the marketing program to go with it, right? So there's all kinds of things that would not be IT related. But it's going to be true that for any kind of project that we're going to be doing, people in that industry kind of have a way they go about it, okay? So people who build roads, more or less, they do the same kinds of activities in the same kinds of phases. People who build houses, the same thing. It turns out that people who build information technology solutions have a couple of alternatives for the way that they organize their projects. And because we're focusing on those, we're going to talk about those in this chapter. So many organizations develop their own project management methodologies, especially for IT projects. So what are they doing? Well, they're defining what are the phases of the project, exactly what the deliverables are, what they should look like, what standards there are for their quality, who's supposed to approve them, all those kinds of things. All right. Now, you, before you start an IT project, have to subscribe to one or the other. Okay. We're going to talk about several here. So a methodology describes how things should be done. A standard, by comparison, it describes what should be done. So what kinds of methodologies could we take? Well, there's a project methodology that's pretty popular in England called Prince2. We talked about Agile software development. IBM has a methodology that they've been selling for a while. It's called the Rational Unified Process, or RUP. There is a methodology for process improvement projects called Six Sigma that we're going to talk about some more when we get to quality. These all are candidates that you might want to take a look at when you decide which approach to the project you're going to adopt. The biggest thing that's happening and related to IT or information, other kinds of information projects these days is the increasing interest in managing projects in an agile way. Okay, and we have from the text some kind of observation about how things are going in India, which of course they're doing a lot of IT projects because they've been able to snag a lot of work from the U.S. because they've made a concerted effort to tap that market where they think they have, among other things, labor cost advantages. Okay? So in India, 2/3 of organizations are in sub-stage of adopting the Agile approach. They're realizing benefits in terms of the software and the business, in terms of faster delivery of products to the customer and improved ability to manage changing requirements, etc. Organizations struggle with the magnitude of the cultural shift required for Agile, opposition to change, a lack of coaching and help in the Agile adoption process, and a lack of qualified people. Now, you remember one version of Agile is called Scrum, and we have a daily stand-up meeting called the Daily Scrum. So the daily stand-up meeting, iteration planning, and release planning are the most commonly used practices, while paired programming and open workspaces are not popular. Okay, and those paired programming and co-location and open workspaces are a part of what the Scrum people profess could lead to greater productivity. So here's a snapshot from the India software industry that says a lot of organizations are doing something with Agile, a full 2/3, but there's a lot of friction, right? And that's not unlike what you're seeing in the US. Okay, now here's another interesting claim from the text. Organizations that excel in PM complete 89% of their projects successfully, compared to only 36% of organizations that do not have good project management processes. And I think that when you straighten out the language there, I think they're saying that organizations that are doing very well are having 89% successful projects. Organizations that are not doing well are as low as 36% of their projects, but that's not what that sentence actually says. PMI are friendly professional organization for PM. It estimates that poor project performance costs over $109 million for every $1 billion invested in projects and programs. So $1 billion is 1,000 million. So 109 over 1,000, it's a little bit more than 10%, a little bit less than 11%. 10.9% uh, is being spent that could be saved if we did a better job of PM. So there's a real opportunity there for those of us who are not really good at this yet. So here's the project we're going to be taking a look at in the chapter. It's a consulting firm called JWD, and they're a consulting firm that wants to show off their project management expertise. And so what they want to do is they want to create an intranet site that their consultants can use in order to have a lot of information at their fingertips regarding project management, such that they can do a better job of being and appearing to be project management experts. Okay? So we're going to take two approaches to this. First of all, we're going to see the predictive approach with a waterfall kind of approach, and then we're going to see an adaptive approach with Scrum. Okay? So this case study provides an example of what's involved in initiating, planning, executing, controlling, and closing an IT project. You can download templates for creating your own project management documents from the companion website for the book. And you can find that at the publisher's website. And I think you can also find the link in the text of the textbook. So what we're trying to do here, this is what the note's about, is we're trying to give you a big picture view of managing a project, right? And later, when we get into each of the knowledge areas, we're going to give you detailed information about each one, about the theories and the tools and techniques that relate to the knowledge area. So this should be answering the question, how does this all fit together on a real project? Okay, because we want you to have a pretty good idea of that before we start going through a litany of the details. Project pre-initiation, okay? In most organizations, somebody has to decide whether we're going to even try to get a project started, okay? What we don't want to do is we don't want to fund a whole project team to go start a project and then only to find out after we have allocated all the people and all the money and all that kind of stuff that this isn't really feasible, okay? So this pre-initiation work historically has been called feasibility analysis, okay? So it's a good practice to lay the groundwork for a project before it officially starts. Senior managers often perform several pre-initiation tasks, including the following. They try to estimate the scope, the time, the cost constraints for the project. They try to identify the project sponsor. They try to identify a project manager. They try to develop a business case for the project. So in our textbook, in table 3-2, you'll see an example of a business case. So that's an analysis that tries to make a case for the viability of the project, usually in economic terms. They meet with the project manager to review the process and expectations for managing the project. They determine if the project should be divided into two or more smaller projects, or if it makes sense to keep it as one. All right, so there's thought and consideration which goes into the project before we really kick it off, give it a PM, and get into formal initiation. And a lot of people like to call it, as we do here, pre-initiation. Then, once we decide to go ahead, then we get into formal project initiation. So that includes recognizing starting a new project or a project phase, The main goal is to formally select and start off projects. And so table 3-3 from the book shows the project initiation knowledge areas, processes, and outputs. So this kind of way of looking at the parts of project management by saying these are the knowledge areas that this activity is going to touch on. These are the individual processes that get done. For instance, develop project charter and identify stakeholders. And these are the outputs. People always want to know, what's the deliverable? What are we getting for this activity? Because to a certain extent, the activity that we do on a project has no value in its own right. Its only value is in that it creates things that have a lasting value for us. So the outputs here, the project charter and the stakeholder register, are two outputs of the two major processes that are part of project initiation. Stakeholder register. So here on slide 13, we see a typical register. This is just information about each of the people who we consider to be stakeholders on the project. Okay? These include, it's really sort of interesting to see the column here, project role. So we have a project sponsor, we have a project manager, we have a team member, and we have 2 advisors. Stakeholder management strategy. So when we start to talk about stakeholder management, we'll talk about creating a document, maybe not one that we're going to publish, but we're going to do the thinking that would go into this kind of document, where we're going to say for each person, how interested are they in the project? How much influence do they have on the project? And as the project manager, how do we intend to capitalize on that and manage our relationship with that stakeholder? Because this could have sensitive information in it, this is not a thing that we typically publish. Okay? And maybe not something that we actually commit to paper or to electronic paper, but this kind of thinking, it's important for it to go on. Okay, project charters. So if you want to see a project charter, look in the text in table 3-6 for an example of a charter. Charters are normally short, business-oriented documents that include key project information and stakeholder signatures. So we're trying to describe our understanding about the project, and then we're trying to get consensus around a plan to proceed, and that consensus is embodied in the signatures of the stakeholders when they sign off on the charter. Once we have a charter, then we typically have a kickoff meeting, and this is an opportunity so the stakeholders can meet each other, review the goals of the project, discuss future plans, and start to get some group identity. So here on slide 16 is a typical agenda for a kickoff meeting. And I'm going to leave that for you to read on your own. That's from the text as well. Project planning. So what comes after the initiation process group? Planning process group. Okay. So the main purpose of project planning is to guide the execution. And That's an important point of view. We don't want to do anything on a project in it because it's kind of good activity in its own right. What we want to do is we want to do things that create value down the road. Okay, so the value of a plan should be that it's going to guide the execution. If we don't have a high quality plan that can be used to guide the execution, perhaps we're not spending our time and money well during planning. Each of the knowledge areas that we're going to cover includes some bit of planning. And so as we go through each of the knowledge areas, we're going to look at the kind of documents that we might produce that could eventually become part of an integrated project plan. So what are the key outputs included in the JWD project? Well, a team contract, so that's for team organization. A work breakdown structure, that's an expression of the scope. A project schedule in the form of a Gantt chart with all dependencies and resources entered. That's part of our planning for time. And a list of prioritized risks, that's part of risk planning. Okay? And you can see sample documents on page 101. Now, how will we learn how to do all these things? Well, we're going to learn as we go through each of the knowledge areas. So a team contract in human resource, scope statement in scope, work breakdown structure in scope, Gantt chart in time, risk register in risk management. Okay? What we're doing is we're showing this all to you now because we want you to see it all fitting together before we start to teach you how to create the individual parts. So here is a Gantt chart. Again, a Gantt chart is a calendar-oriented chart in which on the left side we typically have text categories that identify either phases or tasks within a phase. And on the right side, we have bars that show when the team is going to be working on that phase or task. And this is a Gantt chart for the JWD Consulting intranet site. Here's an example of a risk register that's been prioritized. So let's look at the top 3 or 4. Lack of inputs from internal consultants, lack of inputs from client representative, the security of the new system, outsourcing and purchasing for the article retrieval, and the ask the expert features. So those are the 4 things that they think are most likely to go wrong. Okay, and we're going to learn more about how to construct that when we get to the chapter on risk management. Now we're going to move on to the project executing process group. It usually takes the most time and the resources to perform the project execution. And when you consider that that's the glory work, that's the work itself, well, that's appropriate. Project managers must use their leadership skills to handle the many challenges that occur during project execution, not surprisingly. And the text on table 311, it lists the executing processes and outputs. Many project sponsors and customers focus on deliverables related to providing the products, services, or results desired from the project. And something that comes out and helps us to monitor project execution is a milestone report, which helps us to focus on completing the major milestones. Now, this is the first time we talked about milestones. Milestones are events that happen in the project that we all look forward to as a measurement of how far done we are. Okay, so completing the design phase, completing the programming and testing phase. Those are the kind of things where we set a milestone there. We have a date on which we expect to get there, and then we compare, are we going to meet that date? Are we going to come in early? We're going to come in late. Typically, a milestone event, in order to qualify for being a proper milestone for me, it has to pass what I call the pizza party test, which is to say, if in fact we're going to throw a pizza party for the stakeholders, and you say that we're going to celebrate the achievement of whatever the milestone is, people would get it. They would go, oh yeah, that's important for us. Let's go have some pizza and some refreshments and celebrate because we've achieved something great. Okay. If it doesn't pass the pizza party test, then it's probably not a well-chosen milestone. Here's a milestone report that comes from table 3-12. So these are pretty big things like project charter signed, project kickoff meeting held, WBS completed. These are all pretty big things. Okay. We're looking for, I think we're all going to be looking for best practices when we manage our projects. So one way to look at that is to look at PMI has been identifying a project of the year and giving those people an award for it each year for quite a while. Here's a project that won the Quartier International de Montreal. Montreal's international district was a 66-acre urban revitalization project in the heart of downtown Montreal. The $90 million 5-year project turned a once unpopular area into a thriving section of the city with a booming real estate market and has generated $770 million in related construction. So this I think identifies the kind of interests that we're hoping you're going to develop in projects and project management. I think that projects that relate to things that that interest you and that do well, you're probably going to want to know about. Now, if you're not into urban redevelopment or you're not into real estate development, perhaps this isn't a project that's going to catch your attention. But there are a lot of projects that get highlighted as being successful that perhaps are closer to things that interest you. And it's really great to read about them and to get ideas from them, get inspiration from them, that kind of stuff. Now we've moved on to project monitoring and controlling. It involves measuring progress towards project objectives, monitoring or identifying if we are deviating from our plan, and if we are deviating from our plan, taking corrective actions. It affects all the other process groups and occurs during all phases of the project life cycle. So don't think of project monitoring and controlling as the thing that happens in a phased kind of a way. It's almost like a layer of kind of frosting over the whole cake. Okay, so some amount of it is going on all the time. Probably during execution, where we probably reach our height of activity, monitoring and controlling effort is at its greatest, but there's always a layer of monitoring and controlling that goes on over top of the project. The outputs from this include performance reports, change requests, and updates to various plans. See the tables in the book. And now, of course, we come to project closing. This is the last of the process groups, and it's the last that happens chronologically. So it involves gaining stakeholder and customer acceptance of the final products and services that are the results of your project. Even if projects are not completed, they should be closed out to learn from the past. The outputs of project closing include project files, so all the records and the artifacts from the project, lessons learned reports. All these are part of a group of things that have a goofy name as far as I'm concerned. They're called organizational process assets. So these are artifacts. These are reports and records that the processes of our organization throw off. And we'd like to keep them, so we consider them to be assets. So these are assets created by organizational processes. So we've come up with a very, I think, vague name of organizational process assets. One of my most unfavored terms in the PMI terminology. Most projects also include a final report and a presentation to the sponsor or senior management, or both. So that is the traditional chronological waterfall-based approach to managing a project. Okay? And the elements that we talked about are important, I think, for all projects. Now, we're going to talk about an agile approach to managing the same project. In particular, we're going to use the agile methodology called Scrum. Okay? It's not going to have quite so many parts. It's going to be simpler. Okay? And it's going to be a little bit different in its focus. But I, for one, believe that when you really think about agile approaches and more traditional approaches, and you experience them, as you get more experience, you see more about how similar they are than how different they are. And of course, the people who are promoting shifting to agile approaches always want to tell you how different they are. Okay, so I'm trying to influence you the other way. So this section demonstrates a more agile approach to managing the same project. We try to highlight the differences that are going to come from the agile approach. An agile project team typically uses several iterations or sprints that deliver incremental portions of the software instead of waiting till the end of the project to provide just one big bang integrated product. So it's a series of sub products that come out of these sprints or iterations that accumulate over time, which become the end product of the project. So our author, Kathy Schwalbe, would like you to make an informed decision about whether you're going to take an agile approach or not. So not a snap decision, okay? Projects with less rigid constraints, projects that have experience and preferably co-located teams, that's everybody working in the same spot. Project that have smaller risks, unclear requirements, and more flexible scheduling would be compatible with an agile approach. So these are all characteristics of the agile approach, okay? So if the problem you're trying to solve is amenable to things that have these kind of characteristics, then agile might be for this project. So In the following analysis, we're using Scrum, which is probably the most popular of the Agile approaches. So we're using the roles that they use in Scrum. We're using the same artifacts. These are things that we create in the project, reports, analyses, those kinds of things. And we're using the same ceremonies. So what are the roles? Okay, we have a product owner, we have a Scrum master, we have a Scrum team or a development team, and we have, okay, so those are the roles. Okay, so who's the product owner? The person responsible for the business value of the project and for deciding what work to do in what order as documented in the product backlog. The product backlog is a list of desired features or user stories, as they're typically called, as identified by the team and the product owner. So who is the product owner? Is the product owner a sponsor? Well, yes and no. It depends on how big your project is and how busy your sponsor is, okay? A product owner is going to be pretty involved in the project. They're going to be taking a look at the outputs of the work that the team does on a regular basis. And they're going to be giving advice and making decisions, and it's going to take up quite a bit of their time. People who are true the project sponsors are maybe too busy for this. So it might be their delegate. Okay, it might be a key person from the sponsor's organization who's going to become the point person for this project. Okay, but it is a representative of the sponsor's organization, if not the sponsor themselves. Okay. Scrum Master is a project manager-like person, but has a different kind of a flavor. This is a person who ensures that the team is productive, facilitates the daily Scrum, that's the meeting we have every day, enables close cooperation across all roles and functions, and removes barriers to prevent the team from being effective. Now, as we get deeper into Scrum, we'll find that the people who develop the methodology see the Scrum Master less as an administrator or a bureaucrat and more as a servant leader. So they see the person as, they see the team as being able to make good decisions on its own, and they see the Scrum Master as a facilitator for the team rather than a big boss. And of course, we have the people on the team. A cross-functional team of 5 to 9 people who organize themselves in the work to produce the results for each sprint. A sprint is this length of time that we're going to do. In some of the Agile approaches, we call these time slots iterations. In Scrum, we call them sprints. And they last from 2 to 4 weeks. And as I've said previously in another chapter, they usually have a fixed length. Okay, so yeah, they could last from 2 to 4 weeks, but we decide for our project, we're going to be doing 3-week sprints or 2-week sprints. And then this becomes a time box. Okay, so one real important aspect of Agile project management is that the time periods, the sprints, are fixed. Okay, so we know how long the sprint is going to take. We're going to discover how much work we get done during the sprint. What doesn't get done during the sprint goes back on the backlog. Okay, and then we decide if it's going to go into the next of the sprints. Okay, so this having a fixed length of time for each of these periods that we're working for each of the sprints puts a box around the time that Agile proponents believe has a really good effect on team behavior. Because when time is limited, okay, we tend to work on the most important things, and where we have to concentrate on that. And what happens is that things that are less important don't get done. And when the project's over, we very often have a list of interesting ideas that we thought were interesting, but they never got important enough to get to the top of the pile. And when we look at them collectively, we're going to say, you know what? We don't have to do those. So it's this time boxing aspect of the Scrum approach to schedule that creates a whole dynamic that drives a lot of the value that we're expecting to get from it. Scrum artifacts. So what are the reports and analyses that we do? So an artifact is a useful object created by people. So project management people like to talk about artifacts. These are things that are thrown off of projects. These are things that the PMI people would call organizational process assets. Okay? The Scrum artifacts include a product backlog, a sprint backlog, and a burn down chart. So what's a product backlog? Well, this is a list of features, usually expressed as user stories, that are prioritized by business value. Okay? Now, who tells us how to prioritize them by business value, and who tells us what the features are? Well, we work with the business owner, and that we use their appreciation of business value in order to prioritize them. What's a sprint backlog? Well, it's a subset of the product backlog that we have committed to work on in the current sprint or the next sprint. So the highest priority items from the product backlog are selected to be completed within a sprint. So we know how long the sprint is. They're a fixed length. Let's say we're doing 3-week sprints. Okay. So what we want to pick is an assortment of highest priority features or user stories from the product backlog. And we want to decide that we're going to work on them in the sprint. Now, I have to point out that it's just not by priority, okay? When we look at all the features that get on the backlog, some of them naturally go together. There's an efficiency in working with them together. So what we want to do is we want to pick things from the top of the high priority list, and then we want to have things that go with them in an efficient way, accompany them, even if they're not high priority in their own right. They may enable higher priority things. So we want to pick a mix of features or user stories that are collectively the most important things. And we also want to pick a quantity of things that we think we can get done. Okay? And what's a burn down chart? Well, a burn down chart shows cumulatively the work remaining to be done on a day-by-day basis. So these are this is how much of the backlog hasn't been completed. And of course, we're expecting that to be a graph that's going to start high and go down low. So it's going to be a high to low kind of curve. Now, we have some things that go on. We have meetings and events that go on throughout the Scrum process, and we call these ceremonies. This is a term that Scrum people in particular like, that Agile people in general like, and maybe to a certain extent, project management people have become friendly to. So these are events. So we have a sprint planning session. That's a meeting with the team to select a set of work from the product backlog to deliver during a sprint. And we kind of talked about how we make those decisions. We have the daily Scrum. This is a short meeting for the development team to share progress and challenges and plan the work for the day. This is not a problem-solving meeting. This is a coordination meeting. Okay, it's usually short. It's usually a quarter of an hour long or so. It leads to other meetings with subsets of the participants that may have a problem-solving orientation. It may be longer. And what a lot of people do in order to make sure it's short and sweet is they don't sit down. So they have a stand-up meeting once a day, typically first thing in the morning when everybody gets in, and perhaps they have their cup of coffee or tea or whatever they have. They stand around in a group. A lot of times it's around a conference table so they can put their notes on the table. And they tend to go around, and a person kind of says, well, here's where I am in terms of my productivity, and here's who I need to coordinate with next. And from those kinds of interactions, we get the idea of what further coordination we need to do to keep our productivity for the day at its highest. At the end of a sprint, we do a sprint review. This is a meeting in which the team demonstrates to the project owner what it has completed during the sprint. We have sprint retrospectives. This is a meeting in which the team looks for ways to improve the product and the process based on the review and the actual performance of the development team. Now, you can't really fully appreciate the dynamics that are going on in a Scrum team unless you see them as a self-managing group. So this is really an approach to work and to management that assumes that a team of capable people want to work hard. They know a lot about the work that they're doing, how to prioritize and how to manage it. And they ought to have a lot of control over their work process and priorities. And really all these meetings and ceremonies really flow from that gestalt. So here's a chart that we've seen before. And this kind of gives you a bit of a flow of activities within Scrum. So one of the things that we're trying to do here is we're trying to relate it to the traditional PMI process groups. So for instance, if you look on the bottom, if we look along the bottom, we say, well, we have planning activities, we have executing activities, and we have closing activities. So what are the planning activities? Well, the creation of the product backlog and the maintenance of that, and the creation of each subsequent sprint backlog and the maintenance of that. What are the executing activities? Well, we have a daily Scrum. Okay. We work on a sprint for some fixed length of time. 2 to 4 weeks is misleading because we pick a number. We just don't see whether it comes in between 2 and 4. Where we pick a number like 3 or 4 or 2, and that's what we do. Okay, and where they're always going to be that long. Typically, they're all the same length. We go around. We have our daily scrums, and then when we get to the end, we have a potentially shippable product increment And we have a sprint review meeting in which we show the subset of the product that we've built to the product owner and to other stakeholders. And we want to hear whether they find it acceptable, whether they need improvements and what those improvements are. And to the extent that we have additional work that has to be done, then we add it to the product backlog. So if they love everything just the way it is, well, then nothing to add to the product backlog. If we didn't get everything done, then things that we didn't get done go back on the product backlog. If there's some things that need to be revised, then we come up with some expression of them and we put them on the product backlog. Then immediately after the sprint review, we, without the product owner, just sort of amongst us team Scrum team people, we have the sprint retrospective where we kind of decide, is there anything we need to shift in the way we're approaching things? And then we come right back out of that. We do the planning for the next of the sprints and we start the next one. Okay, so again, when you look at this, there's not a great incompatibility with the classical PMI process groups. Certainly here, we have planning, executing, and closing. The stuff along the top where we're doing maybe the daily Scrum and we're doing sprint review and all that kind of stuff, that's part of monitoring and controlling. And the only thing left is initiating. And at least you can imagine that the approach to initiating the project is pretty much the same. This is what comes before what's going on in planning. So again, these things are different in some ways, but the point that we're really trying to make here is you can take that PMI process group framework and you can find a way to make to have useful insights about the Scrum approach. So what would some of the unique Scrum activities be by process group? In initiating, determining the roles that different people are going to play, deciding how many sprints will compose each of the releases, and how long each of the sprints will be. We say that at the end of every sprint we have shippable product, but it's shippable in terms of the quality of its implementation. We don't typically think that we're going to ship and use at the end of every sprint, but we have this thing called a release schedule where groups of sprints can be kind of batched up, and then we actually intend to release the software at the end of maybe the third sprint, the seventh sprint, and the 15th sprint. Okay, so that's what we mean by releases, right? And of course, we're going to be, okay, that's the point to make there. In planning, creating the product backlog, that's both identifying the features or user stories and composing them into a backlog, creating the sprint backlog. Creating the release backlog. Plan work each day in the daily Scrum. Document stumbling blocks in a list. Okay, that's probably going to come out of the daily Scrum because the Scrum Master is supposed to be clearing those for the team, the servant leader. And then executing, complete the tasks each day during sprints in order to get the work done and burn down the backlog for the sprint. Produce a shippable product at the end of each sprint. And again, shippable has a special meaning for Scrum. It has to do with its real quality. It's not play code, it's the real code that we could install. That's not to say that the product is at a point where it's in a usable, releasable increment. Some combination of sprints are going to make up a release. Okay, so shippable as a term can be misleading to a certain extent. Monitoring and controlling, resolving issues and blockers, create and update the burn down chart, demonstrate the completed product during the sprint review meeting, and then closing, reflect on how to improve the product and process during the sprint reflection meeting. So here we're really drawing you pictures of how the process groups relate to Scrum activities. Now these are not terms that Scrum people always use. All right. And in fact, there are some Scrum people that say, oh, that PMI stuff, that's all that Waterfall stuff. We're completely different. We've invented the world. Okay. Well, here's a really thoughtful person in Kathy Schwalbe saying, well, you know what, guys, that's not completely true. Because if you really understand the project management body of knowledge and you go to apply it to what you guys do, well, it fits. Okay? And maybe you're not so special, but we love you. You like to feel special. You can talk special. And you can come to our conferences as long as you're not too disruptive. Okay? So people like the Scrum guys because they generate a lot of interest in PM. Okay? The more traditional people probably don't like the Scrum guys because they're so darn full of themselves. Okay, but still, even though they're so darn full of themselves, they've gotten a whole generation of people interested in managing projects, and they have a formula that's kind of sexy and appealing. And people like me and people like Kathy Schwalbe want them to be part of formal PM. And so when they say, oh, we're completely unlike those other guys, well, we don't really listen to that. Okay? And not all of them do, but certainly some of them do. And you'll see where they say, oh, those old project management guys, they're all geezers, and that doesn't have anything to do with what we do. What we do is Agile, and nothing's like Agile. Well, look at this analysis. Agile's like the general approach that we talk about in the PMI body of knowledge. So planning, so here we go through each of these things. So we say how planning is the same and how's planning different. So let's look for different. Descriptions of work identified in the product and sprint backlogs. More detailed work is documented in technical stories. Those are user stories. We estimate a velocity or capacity for each sprint. We have a release road map often used for the schedule. Okay. Now, I'm just going to say that planning is different in my mind in that in a more traditional kind of a waterfall project, we say at the beginning, we actually claimed that we've looked at all the work and we think that it fits into a schedule that looks like this, and we think it's going to cost whatever. We're not committing to that from an Agile point of view. In an Agile point of view, we say, here are all the features. Here's the workload, okay? This is the potential scope of the project. It's prioritized. We think that if we do a certain number of sprints as so many weeks long with a project team X big, that we can get enough of this project done that everybody's going to be happy. Are we committing that we can get it all done? No, we're not. So that's a different aspect of it. Waterfall and deterministic planning says we can know all about this stuff and we can come up with a master plan. Not so with Agile. They say we can come up with a plan here and we can commit to the fact that people are going to be happy at the end. So we're going to get most of this stuff done. But we're going to discover what's most important about these things as we experience our way through the project. And there will be some things that are left over and not done. And we're all going to decide together when to stop the project. Well, from a planning point of view, I think those are two different points of view. They're compatible with each other, but they're different. And here is a baseline Gantt chart using Scrum. Okay. The backlogs. Okay. Good. Let's look at the executing. Not different from the PM bot guide. Still produce products. We have to lead people, etc. What's different? We produce several releases of software. Okay. So this is the truth, although I tend to characterize it slightly differently. Okay. There are plenty of traditional waterfall projects that we break up into phased implementations. So we might take all the functionality of the solution that we're trying to build. We might say that it's comprised by 3 subsystems, and we're going to deliver them 1, 2, and 3 in 6 months increments. So there's nothing that says about a traditional waterfall kind of approach that you can't have 3 waterfalls, 1 for deliverable 1, 1 for deliverable 2, and 1 for deliverable 3. Okay? So I don't think that they're different like that. The Agile people would have you believe it, but having been involved in waterfall projects that phase their deliverables for 40 years, I know firsthand that this is not a new idea that came from Agile. What's different about Agile is we're going to spend less time up front creating diagrams and specifications, and we're going to be creating executable code sooner. So if you look at the executing itself, less drawing, less creating things on paper or electronic paper, and more creating code. Okay? Well, the result of that is that we have code sooner. We can test the code sooner. Now, some people with a more historic point of view have said, yeah, you're testing code sooner, but you don't have an agreement ahead of time about what exactly the code should do. People from the Agile point of view would say, well, we have to agree sometime, but let's agree when we're working on the real code and not when we're working on some kind of a paper plan. So the difference between whether we're working on paper plans first and real code second in the traditional approach, or whether we're working on real code sooner in the Agile approach, that is a real difference. Now, there's a risk in going right to real code. You could burn up a lot of time creating real code that nobody wants, okay? And the Agile guys would say that they have that covered. But there is a different point of view. There's the, again, there's the waterfall kind of approach where we're going to do things on paper first and have everybody sign off on them, and then we're going to build them. And There's the Agile kind of approach where the agreeing and the building are really going hand in hand. And there's some kinds of projects that lend themselves to that, and some kinds of projects that maybe don't lend themselves to that. Maybe that's how you would decide which approach you were going to take. Monitoring and controlling, not different from the PMI guide. You still check the actual work versus the planned work, although the plan is less extensive. The names of the key reviews are the daily Scrum and the sprint review. A sprint board is usually used instead of a tracking Gantt or other tools. So Scrum teams like to track their work on a whiteboard. And you might use a burn down chart versus an earned value chart. And we've already learned about burn down charts, and we'll learn about earned value charts when we get to the chapter on cost. Here's a burn down chart. Okay. So let's deal with this term velocity. Okay. Now, something we haven't talked about before in the chapter is each Scrum team is expected to come up with a priority for each of their pieces of work, either a user story or a task. And they're also asked to come up with an estimate in point values. And the point values are kind of arbitrary. They only have to be consistent within a project. Okay, so something that would be kind of easy to do, we could do quickly, team 2 could do quickly, we might say, has got 5 points. Something that would be kind of Midland would be, maybe 10, or something that would be kind of hard could be 30 or 40. Okay. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to get an idea about how much effort is in these things, but we don't want to go so far as to do person days. Okay. We do points. There's even this really almost humorous kind of fun thing that we do when we estimate these things, so that we have these poker cards that are called Fibonacci poker, because we use the number series, the Fibonacci number series, in order to pick point values to give to each of the user stories. And again, we're coming up with arbitrary point values that we can see, oh, that's about 2 times as big as that, or 4 times as big as that. Then how many points you get done in a sprint becomes your velocity. So in a 3-week sprint, let's say our standard sprints are 3 weeks long, let's say we get 120 points done per sprint. So our velocity is 120 points per sprint. Now here it looks like, and on the burn down chart that we're looking at, if we look at ideal velocity, it starts at 200 points and it goes all the way down to 0. So that's how we expect it's going to happen. We're going to really start to burn it down a couple days after we start, and we're going to expect to be all the way down a couple days before we finish. And then, of course, if you look at how things actually track through the sprint, well, they don't track exactly to that. Okay? I think you'd probably be sort of the other way. You would tend to lag the ideal velocity line and then maybe catch up with it and go ahead of it, and then get behind and go ahead, and then come in at the same place in the end if you're going to have a really good if you're going to have a sprint where you did a really good job. So one of the things we're doing in terms of coming up with these somewhat arbitrary but consistent point estimates for the pieces of work that we have to do is we want to get better and better at how many user stories we pick from the backlog for the whole project to put into the backlog for the sprint. And what we want to do is we want to get closer and closer to having things fit exactly. So if we improve our estimation and we improve our coordination and all those kinds of things, we ought to get to the point where we can get, 100 points done, 50 points done, 250 points done, because the scales are really determined by the team. It's not the absolute amount of the points. You just want to get consistent from sprint to sprint that you know about how much is going to fit in. So this, how many points you're able to burn down in a sprint becomes your velocity. Okay? Closing, is that the same or different? Well, it's the same in which we still focus on the acceptance of the deliverables and we reflect. Different in the retrospect is similar to a lessons learned report, but it focuses on a shorter time period. It's intended to answer two fundamental questions: what went well during the last sprint and we should continue doing, and what would we do differently? So built in to the Scrum approach is maybe a continuous process improvement cycle that's a shorter term. Okay, if you look at the traditional PMI, you get to closing, and we do say that we close each of the phases. So we would, at the end of each phase, say, well, what have we learned about this phase? But here, because we're doing these these sprints, and they're smaller, they're more atomic, we get more reflection opportunities. And maybe that'll give us a greater opportunity to do continuous improvement of the processes that we're doing. And perhaps that difference shows a lot of promise. Now, there were templates that were used within the chapter, and if you want to know what templates are available with the book, look on table 3-20, and you ought to be able to get the templates from the book from either the publisher's website or Kathy Schwalbe's own, both of which are identified on this slide. So just to summarize, we've taken two approaches to the organization of the work and the management of the same project. We've given you a sort of a waterfall version, and we've given you a Scrum version. And we're hoping that does really two things. One is it helps you kind of understand the difference between those two approaches, because there's a lot of thought and conversation about that in project management today. But the other thing is we want you to kind of see how all this stuff we're going to learn about really fits into a real project. So we hope that was illustrated as well. And having said that, I'm going to say bye until next time. Bye-bye.